Matthew 8, verses 14 to 22. When Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and began to wait on him. When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word and healed all who were ill. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and bore our diseases. When Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. Then a teacher of the law came to him and said, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. Jesus replied, Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Another disciple said to him, Lord, first let me go and bury my father. But Jesus told him, Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead.
I'm reading from Isaiah chapter 39, verses 1 to 8. At that time, Merodach Baladan, son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent Hezekiah letters and a gift because he'd heard of his illness and recovery. Hezekiah received the envoys gladly and showed them what was in his storehouses, the silver, the gold, the spices, the fine oil, his entire armory, and everything found among his treasures. There was nothing in his palace or in all his kingdom that Hezekiah did not show them. Then Isaiah the prophet went to King Hezekiah and asked, What did those men say, and where did they come from? From a distant land, Hezekiah said. They came to me from Babylon. And the prophet asked, What did they see in your palace? They saw everything in my palace, Hezekiah said. There's nothing amongst my treasures that I did not show them. Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, Hear the word of the Lord Almighty. The time will surely come when everything in your palace and all that your fathers have stored up until this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. And some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood who were born to you, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. The word of the Lord you've spoken is good, Hezekiah replied, for he thought, there will be peace and security in my lifetime. This is the word of the Lord.
There are Bibles at the back if anyone should need them and hasn't brought them with you. I can never tell these days because so many people have the Bible on their phone and they will sit looking at the Bible in that way. They could, of course, be playing Candy Crush or something and pretending they're looking at the Bible, but I trust you more than you know. This is a passage that scares me because in a way it applies just as much to our day as it does to the day in which it recounts and the day in which it was written. You know, Babylon has a certain resonance for people who know about things. You don't have to know about the Bible particularly to know what Babylon represents. If you're a fan of music, perhaps good music, you're a fan of maybe Bob Marley, you know, he writes songs that warn against people being taken down to Babylon. If you're a fan of bad music, you might remember from the 1970s, Boney M and their classic, in inverted commas, By the Rivers of Babylon, which recounted the words of one of the Psalms about the people of Israel being taken off to be slaves, partially sung by a man in white tights. which I always thought added to the impact of the song. But that's in Boney M, not in the Bible. This is the first contact that Israel had with Babylon. And at this point, Hezekiah had every reason not to be suspicious of these visiting people, but the way in which he reacted to the word of God that was given to him about this visit is something that we should reflect on and cause us to consider our own lives. For the story begins in what you might call an act of international diplomacy. There, of course, is different kinds of international diplomacy. A few weeks ago, our own Prime Minister, who most of the time, he said, saying this cautiously, doesn't seem to achieve a great deal of anything, flew out to Israel to find out what the situation there was and see for himself. And that seemed to be a good and necessary thing to do, and not least something that meant he was putting himself in danger. On the other side of the coin, there was a story in the news a few weeks before that where Mr. Putin of Russia greeted the leader of North Korea, and they had a get-together to discuss things which had as much promise for the future of the world as perhaps the three witches hanging around to meet Macbeth around their cauldron. You can tell I'm not a fan of dictators. But here, Hezekiah does something which is not dissimilar, as most countries would do if a leader came that they knew nothing about. Marduk Baladan, son of Baladan, I'll get this right in a moment, had heard of Hezekiah's illness and recovery. Now, he wasn't here, I don't think, concerned for King Hezekiah. He was amazed about what had happened. And like so often in the world, when something remarkable happens, you want to see it for yourself. I mean, it was in this way in the days of Jesus. Jesus did some amazing things, and some people came because they saw the work of God there. Others came and it became like a circus. Show us the next trick. You know, sometimes you see on perhaps the newspaper or the internet or the television, you might hear something that a magician has done. And people say, oh, wow, what an amazing thing that has happened. And then crowds gather to see it. I mean, one of the most long, ongoing example like this is that man, Uri Geller, who was in the news when I was a little boy and has made his whole life and career by being able to bend a spoon without apparently applying undue pressure to it. And people say, well, does he do it? Does he cheat? What is really happening? And I'm left thinking, well, if he does do it, what's he actually achieving? What does it matter? He has made a perfectly useful spoon into something that is useless. His other trick is that he will stop the watch of somebody in the audience. And you think, well, that person had a watch that was particularly useful. It told the time, which is what watches are for, and now it doesn't work anymore. So, of all the Jewish men in the world, Uri Geller being from that background, I have little time for him. He has made his money doing things that are pointless. But what God had done in Hezekiah's life was truly amazing. He had healed him from certain death and added 15 years to his life. And so the nations around were curious. It's a little bit like, I don't know if you're aware of this, perhaps Joshua is more aware of this than most people in the congregation. It will soon be that time of year when we will be celebrating Christmas. And at Christmas, one of the things that we mark is the journey of the wise men, to visit the baby Jesus. And so in that instance, they traveled a great distance to see a baby being born because they had been told that this baby would be a great king. And in this instance, then Marduk Baladan, or Babylon, I am going to get that name right in a while, had obviously been truly impressed by the stories he'd heard, and Hezekiah, who received him, was eager to impress. You can imagine, come into my palace, see my gold, my spices, see my fine olive oil. Sounds like something and nothing, but try buying sunflower oil in the country these days. There's not a lot of it around. Showed him his armory. You can almost imagine the king of Babylon going round with a pad of paper and a pencil, marking off in a 5-bar gate and saying, they've got these weapons, they've got these arms, they've got these shields. Better start preparing to have more than that. And Isaiah, who was usually used by God to deliver declarations on other issues, this time came up with very practical news. He said that because you've done this, you will be carried off to Babylon. All the things that you've shown to the king of Babylon, nothing will be left. And some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, who will be born to you, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Now, Joshua, if you're not sure what a eunuch is, ask Pat after the service. She'll tell you. Or your mum. Ask your mum. I don't care who I embarrass. But this is a proclamation that ought to shake Hezekiah to the core. It is a proclamation that says disaster is coming. And Hezekiah just kind of sits back in his throne, cleans his glasses, polishes his shoes, and thinks to himself, the word of the Lord is good, for there will be peace and security in my lifetime. And this is the thing. And this is where it really bites, and it applies to all of us. And it applies to the nature of the church in this country, in this town, and worldwide. Because if the church does not do the job that God has given it, then woe betide the future generations. And the thing is that if we don't do the job that God has given us, it is our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren that will be impacted. And sometimes people in the church, they don't get this. They don't get the importance. For example, I don't mind occasionally commending our church for the things we do and the agenda we've set out for ourselves. I know that in many ways we're not the best church in the world, but we have significant things that we try to do. And I was praying earlier for Ninoshka, and let me commend her here again, because the work that she does in the schools is so very important, because it educates the children. And if the children are educated, it builds the next generation of our society. Now, there are some churches that will say to me, and I've had church leaders say to me this in the past, well, it's unnecessary to do that. What you should be doing is winning converts. Because unless you win converts, if Jesus comes back tomorrow, then those people are going to be lost. Now that is partially right. We should be winning converts, but also we should be seeking to build the society around us. We should be helping those who are on the fringes of society. We should be helping those who are in education. And that doesn't only mean teaching from the Bible. It doesn't only mean building a religious education curriculum. It means ensuring that children are literate. Because one of the things that the church also says, and I hear this every month, is the church says, education these days is terrible. Education is going down the drain. What is the government doing about education? What is Hammersmith and Fulham Council doing about education? Well, this is the thing. It is not only the job of the government, it is not only the job of Hammersmith and Fulham Council, although I don't seek to take away their responsibility, it is the work of the church. We need to build a country around us that is on the values of Christ. The other thing that people say to me is, We used to be a Christian country and we're not a Christian country anymore. Best I can figure out, we never were a Christian country. We were a country where there were Christians. And lo and behold, we are still a country where there are Christians. And it is the Christians who are the light of the world and the salt of the earth. And we have to take the values that we have been given and impact them. Jesus said that the most two important teachings in the Bible was love the Lord your God with all your being and love your neighbor. He never said anything about banging your neighbor over the head with the Bible and being unkind while you were doing it. You know, Christians can be very good at that. There's a gentleman who stands opposite Hammersmith Broadway tube station, and everybody that passes, he tells them how much God is unhappy with them. And I passed a bunch of ladies, I want to get the ladies into this as well, who were preaching on King Street a couple of weeks ago. And I could hear from the words that the lady was speaking that she was talking about the love of God. But she sounded like she was angry, and therefore God sounded like he was angry. And I spoke to one of her colleagues who knew I was a pastor, and I said, don't you think that just if she changed the tone of her voice, people would listen to her? And that's something that the church needs to do. We need to go into the schools. We need to sit down with the homeless. And more than anything, we need not to give up on them if they show a reluctance to convert in the short term. Of course, heaven and hell are important. But showing love to your neighbor, according to Jesus anyway, is more important. And so Hezekiah, when he hears, and this is the burden that I have placed on Fabricia, when he hears that his descendants are going to be taken into the palace of the king of Babylon and made into eunuchs, it's like, what do I care? It's not me. But what he doesn't realize is that that means that his family stops with his children. There will be no grandchildren. I can guarantee this. I know what it means. But he sits back in his throne and says, the word of the Lord you have spoken is good. You know, sometimes people say that, I don't know if you've heard that, people say that, eat, drink, and be merry. But they don't always finish the verse, for it is from the Bible. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. It is a dreadful thing that Hezekiah says. And if we are inactive as Christians, whether it be in our preaching of the gospel, whether it be in the ethics and morals that are impacting our society hugely, whether it be in education, whether it be that we're only concerned for ourselves and not for our children, not for our grandchildren. You know? I knew a family in my last church, and this is difficult. I hope they're not going to hear the recording of this, but it is, I think, necessary. And they were from Sri Lanka. And once at our church, we had a Sri Lankan evening where we were served Sri Lankan food and we watched Sri Lankan dance and we heard Sri Lankan songs. And afterwards I spoke to one of the young ladies who I think was probably 16 or 17 at the time. And I said, that was beautiful. What were the words you were singing? What do they mean? She said, I don't have a clue. We've been taught to sing them phonetically, so we can sing them. But the people like to hear them because they're from the old country. But educationally, they were valueless. And one of the things I hear from churches, some of the biggest churches in London are Nigerian churches. And the problem for the Nigerian churches is that the next generation of Nigerians are not receiving the gospel because they are in a church that is primarily about Nigerian culture. Unless they're in church on a Sunday, the thing they need to learn about is how to deal with English culture. And so therefore, being taught the morals and ideas of their old country is of little value. And I know it makes us feel warm inside to be reminded of how it was when we were younger. But people need to make advancement where they are now. And again, without making her head swell, this is why I'm very proud of Ninoshka. I know sometimes I make little jokes and skits about her, but don't take me seriously. I think she's marvelous. And she goes into school to ensure that the children are learning things of value. In the new year, we have groups coming from local schools to hear about our work in the community. And that is many, many facets that they want to hear. And one of the things they're always surprised at is that the church feels that it should be at the heart of the community, taking care of people, loving them. I guess most of you know that most every year Isabel and I go on holiday to the coast, to Whitby. And one of the things about Whitby is that as you enter in to the harbour there are rocks beneath the surface of the water that you cannot see. And so for hundreds of years there have been lighthouses. I once took Isabel up a lighthouse and she got very scared. She was very scared. I don't like heights. She likes heights even less. But imagine if the lighthouse had not been there, how busy the Lifeboat Institute would be, because there would be hundreds of sea wrecks. Imagine our society if there is not an effective church. An effective church telling people how to be saved, but also an effective church telling people that they are loved by God and that they are loved by their neighbor. Or we can be Hezekiah. You know, Hezekiah's been through all kinds of twists and turns in these last few weeks that we have been looking at his life. He's kind of the snakes and ladders man. You know, he goes up a ladder and then down a snake. He gets to number 98 and then something happens and he ends up back at 0. The difficult thing here is that he thinks he's at 98, and in actual fact, he's at 0. The word of the Lord you've spoken is good. There will be peace and security in my lifetime. It's like you could put the words at the end of the word of the Lord you have spoken is good, and then in brackets, for me. And if the church is good for you, if it sings the songs you want to sing, and you like coming out on a Sunday morning, and that's all it is, then we have missed the point. We are to love the Lord our God with all we are. We are to warn people of the promise of heaven and the dangers of hell, but also we are to work into society the love, because we are their neighbors, and those things that need to be done to build a good society. And we are to teach the values to the next generation, and in that way there will be an opportunity for the church to continue to relate the message of the gospel for a generation to come, to our children and to their children's children. Amen.